No, no buzz. Just Bees Book Club. Um, they speak about a book I read a while ago called "There Is a Rio Grande" by Ruben Reyes Jr. A short story collection that I liked a, a good bit. I really actually liked quite a lot, but that didn't quite stick with me in the way that I kind of expected it to, which is a bummer. That's I don't think know, anything about the writing necessarily. I think the writing is actually very good. Um, I recall it as being very good, and when I was like dipping into it again for recording this thing, hi, this is a Just Bees Book Club. Are you a bee? Like it's just for bees. Um, Before recording this, I was sort of skimming through it again, and there is definitely a thing with this collection where it's like it's really, I think, brilliantly in some ways put together, but that didn't like quite stick with me because it's sort of anchored by every like 2 to 3 stories. There is a bit of what is like I don't like this term, but like basically flash fiction, um, and all of them are titled "An Alternate History of El Salvador or Perhaps the World." And I never quite grasped what the work in these little bits of it's like between 1 and 3 pages. Obviously, I'm working on an advanced reader copy. Um, Never quite grasped what those did with the whole. And I say that because normally I would come at these things and be like, here, this is how this works. And I could be wrong. Usually, I am wrong. I generally assume when I make these broad proclamations, but I don't have even the one to do on this one. And yeah, the thing is, it jumps around in a million different ways. These stories, I know I have some threads to talk through in a moment, but like the whole thing, and again, it's been probably like 4 or 5 months since I actually read this thing, so I'm like not really in a good position to actually talk about it. But it's frustrating because when I read it initially, I was this is gonna stick with me forever, and unfortunately, brains work differently. Shot's all fucked up. That's closer to what it usually is. So I took some notes, and there's like 3 stories, and funnily enough, the first two are two of them, and then it's basically the first two and the last one that I think are excluding the three alternate history stories because I didn't I felt they were really dope things, and like I in my mind just like thinking of recent things that I've like put them in maybe like conversation with I think they thought about the most was Namali Sapel's The Old Drift, the stories in under the title "An Alternate History of El Salvador or Perhaps the World" are not doing the same function as like the mosquitoes and Rift. That is definitely true, but like there was like a handful of other things I also sort of sequenced through, and I say this to say part of the premise of each of the stories in Reyes Jr.'s "There's a Rio Grande in Heaven," this book that I'm talking about, uh, are pastiches or engagements with other texts. Um, so like that is maybe why I was trying to engage with it through other texts, that the feeling of being left short kind of persisted. The first two stories in this, there's one called He Eats His Own. The sort of, not a perspective character because it's a third person story, but the person who is central in the story, named Neto or Nito, I'm sure pronunciation, who we first see slicing open a mango in a very sort of like clinically sensual way, and we sort of slowly learn over the course of 20 pages maybe, that is partnered with a man named Steven. He gets these mangoes specifically from his aunt's mango tree, and like he premium because he has like a job that like allows him to pay for things that is like kind of like a first in his family kind of situation. His partner has grown up in like real poverty, and or is positioned in such a way, and the sort of like driving action of the story is that say Neto's aunt, I'm just landing on a pronunciation because I need to, because I genuinely don't know, is diagnosed with a terminal illness and needs care from basically doctors in the States where Neto and Stephen are, and they like apply for visas and they get denied, and ultimately he decides to pay for a coyote to bring her and Tomas, her kid, who's been tending to this mango tree, across the border, across multiple borders, but ultimately, there's one that's particularly egregious and fascist. In the story, Tomas is the only one who makes it across the border. They like meet up with him and pay off the rest of the debt they owe to the coyote, and take him to, I think, a Burger King or McDonald's, where he like immediately pukes up the hamburger because he has just been, fucking ferried from El Salvador to Arizona. And the story is like sort of disillusion of the life that Neto has, and his also complete inability to acknowledge that, because it literally ends with him like bringing Tomas, who Steven, his partner, has like bonded with very deeply, had these like very important conversations with, and has decided to leave both of them because like this is just not gonna work. But Tomas has nowhere to go because he's a child. They and obviously the aunt, obviously the loss of the aunt, is deeply embedded here. The end of the story is Neto. I've that name different every fucking time. That's really embarrassing. Hi. One take. Just B's book club. You're not a B. Goodbye. Presents Tomas with a present that is basically like he like leads Tomas to a counter, I want to say, that is filled with like gardener's gloves, soil, like planting boxes, some other stuff, and then he like brings a mango tree out from behind his back, or like a sapling. It says like, and you can plant this tomorrow. And then and Tomas, as I recall, screams and cries for the first time in his new country, I believe is the exact phrasing. Uh, and it is, I think, a really, really affecting story of how, I mean, generally speaking, not generally like in the world, but generally to the collection, how borders cause trauma, um, how new wealth causes like these emotional scars that don't allow one to have um, any real relationships, and there will be more. The second story is Try Again. I'm gonna read my little, because I think I wrote this little bio. I, this is the one I'm reading from today. Try Again, the second short story in There is a Rio Grande in Heaven. A poet who hated his son's bisexuality passes. The son buys a cyborg version to try to move past the grief. The hatred persists. This is a story about language. It's a poet, right? I'm not going to try to get into this as much. Just again, generally speaking, and this is a collection about. This is a collection that I think does really, really good things with concept of borders and the way it's written. It does really things with queerness and masculinity. It does really good things with historical traumas. Like there's a story called My Abuela the Puppet about like a woman who is the narrator's grandmother, obviously, who sort of goes through a level of senescence and then literally becomes a puppet. Yeah, like there's a yeah. Here's a quick thing from Try Again. After a few days of gurgled sounds, Dad put words together. Baby talk pulled from the two languages he'd wrapped his tongue around in his lifetime. No say woo I am, he said, this time as I was clearing out his room. This version of Dad didn't need cologne or polo shirts. There is so many bags in hair. Checking, son? There's a lot of stuff to get rid of, Dad, I said, assuming he understood me. The instruction manual said to speak to the robots as I would anyone else. It's a again, it's a story about somebody bringing their dead poet dad's homophobic brain into a weird little body to sort of reconnect from grief. And there's so many good moments, like Dead say here, who I am or whatever, that like resolve really nicely. um, Specifically in the moment where like the dad sort of regains his own sense of hatred and says like Mare E Cone Mariacone Maracone, and then just calls his son a faggot like he did in real life. I think there's not maybe a border, but maybe a boundaries conversation. Not in the like, oh, I have good boundaries, or like, oh, I need to establish my boundaries better. But like, there are hard fucking boundaries around a person's identity that are impossible to exercise from them. They don't know. Maybe me thinking more in psychoanalysis than I am in terms of, fun times with good friends. Um, and the last one I wanted to talk about is the last story, which is a choose your own adventure, which I looked through when the final version came, and I didn't like read it, but it's not the final story. The final story is another instance of an alternate universe of El Salvador, an alternate history of El Salvador, or perhaps the world that begins. There is a Rio Grande in heaven. Oscar and Valeria must cross a million times. It is beautiful, much more beautiful than the river on earth. The water is crystal clear. Stones in the riverbed shine like amulets. The cattails dance, bending down to touch the warm water, moving side to side so the dragonflies and bluets can trip. And then it goes on and on. Again, heresy. But you can see in the copy that I have, every page ends with flip forward to page 000, or turn to page 000. So I wasn't really able to follow the exact train, but there was this little passage that I want to talk about. And before I did that, I wanted to talk about the fact that this is a choose your adventure story, which I think is bad at being an example of choose your adventure stories, or exemplary of them, or an interesting twist on the form, and I think is a very useful example of how both formally and sort of culturally choose your own adventure can be used, because this is again called Variations on Your Migrant Life. It is a story in the second person, as most choose your own adventures are, about being a child who lives specifically in San Vicente, I think, and has to deal with, I think the first choice that comes up, right, is whether your mother or father leaves the U.S. to emigrate there, to illegally emigrate there, to try to send enough money home such that the family can live. And then from there, the choices sort of spiral out to how ultimately you live there, or ultimately you also emigrate, whether that's through your, because again, first choice, does mommy or poppy leave? Does mother or father leave? Who is going, and then what consequences there are downstream from that. And I think the reason that this choose your own adventure stuff works for this, in a way that I don't think you could write this as a non-choose your own adventure story, is it allows this story to have really, really brutal child death endings that you can then sort of turn away from, which I think is what the choose your own adventure format, especially, looking at just like the general choose your own adventure books, or the Goosebumps ones, or the fighting fantasy ones, like there's an understanding in the choose your own adventure in a book format that you are going to die, and then you're going to turn back a page or two stories and then choose a different option and like lead down that one, and then maybe that ends in another really brutal child death, but then you just turn back to the last one before that one and you see if you can find like the good option. And is there a good option here? Who knows? But I think when I was reading through it, initially as a like, ooh, this person, Ruben Reyes Jr., has written some really interesting sort of like variations on a genre, and now there's a Choose Your Own Adventure, and I didn't get to do the like actual experience of doing the flipping pages thing, but I did just read straight through it, and I could sort of pick up the threads as they went on and be like, oh, this would have been where that last thing led to. Um, and again, I don't think the formal use of it is like fascinating, but I do think that it allows for a level of rawness about emigration that really, really works. And there's a bunch more stories in this, and you've read them because you're a bee. Not a bee. Rude. Um, yeah, genuinely, I think this is one of the doper collections of short stories that like also just like does this mixture of like sometimes magical realism and sometimes straight up like science fiction. It's sometimes a big riff on the metamorphosis about a dude who is a reggaeton star that like story like kind of has stuck with me also, which is like kind of embarrassing because I feel like it's an obvious one to stick with you. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think Reyes Jr. is like just a good short story writer, and I have no sense of whether this would translate into a novel. And it doesn't matter. But I don't need to. Thanks for not watching.